Professor Noam Chomsky. An introduction.
The issues that I would like to discuss in these lectures are rooted in the nature of Western industrial societies. In these capitalist democracies, there's a certain tension, perhaps even a contradiction, with regard to where power is located. In a democracy, the people rule, at least in principle. But decision-making power over large areas of social life resides in private hands, and that has a major spillover effect throughout the social order. One way to resolve the tension would be to extend the democratic system to investment, organization of work, and so on. That would be a major social revolution, which, in my view at least, would realize some of the libertarian principles on which the political revolutions of the 18th century were partially founded. Or the tension could be resolved, and sometimes is, by eliminating public interference with state and private power. In advanced industrial societies, the problem is typically approached by more moderate means, by measures to deprive democratic political structures of substantive content while leaving them formally intact. A large part of this task is assumed by ideological institutions. They have the job of channeling thought and attitudes within acceptable bounds, deflecting any potential challenge to established privilege and authority before it can take form and gather strength. This enterprise has many facets and agents. Here I'm going to be primarily concerned with one aspect, thought control, as conducted through the agency of the national media and related elements of the elite intellectual culture. I'll be speaking primarily of the United States, which I know best, but I think that the comments generalize reasonably well to other industrial societies as well. In my opinion, there's much too little inquiry into these matters. My feeling is that citizens of the democratic societies should undertake a course of what we might call intellectual self-defense to protect themselves from manipulation and control and to lay the basis for more meaningful democracy. It's this concern that motivates my comments here.
On Ideas, the 1988 Massey Lectures about media, propaganda, and democracy. A series of 5 talks, one each night this week, divided into 16 sections, including questions from a panel of distinguished Canadian journalists. The Massey Lectures are an annual event on CBC Radio. They began in 1961 and have featured leading figures in literature and politics, religion, and the arts, including Northrop Frye, Jane Jacobs, Carlos Fuentes, Paul Goodman, Claude Lévi-Strauss, C.B. Macpherson, Martin Luther King Jr., and Doris Lessing. The 1988 Massey Lectures are given by Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor in the Departments of Philosophy and Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. Professor Chomsky is an internationally renowned scholar, the leading theorist in the field of structural linguistics, and the author of some 30 books, both technical books in the field of linguistics and books addressed to a general audience, which examine political issues, focusing especially on the place of the United States in international affairs. He is particularly concerned with what Americans find out through their mass media, more properly called, in Professor Chomsky's view, the elite media. His approach to this question involves a massive amount of research. His books are noted for the mountain of data they contain. In September 1988, his latest book, co-authored with Professor Edward Herman, was published by Pantheon. It's called Manufacturing Consent. Some of the raw material for the conclusions he draws in these Massey Lectures can be found in that book, which is in bookstores and libraries now. Throughout his work, Professor Chomsky has based his conclusions on a close analysis of specific cases, but his real interest is in the larger issues that the specific cases point to. What are the enduring institutional characteristics of our media system, the system we call the free press, and how do those characteristics affect what we think we know? A half-century ago, John Dewey observed that criticism of specific abuses has only limited value. The only really fundamental approach to the problem, Dewey said, is to inquire concerning the necessary effect of the present economic system upon the whole system of what he called publicity, upon the judgment of what news is, upon the selection and elimination of matter that is published, upon the treatment of news in both news and editorial columns. The question under this mode of approach is not how many specific abuses there are and how they may be remedied, but how far genuine intellectual freedom and social responsibility are possible on any large scale under the existing economic regime. The philosopher and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr concluded that ordinary people were hardly capable of understanding the world or drawing reasonable conclusions without being subjected to a set of what he called necessary illusions, what we'd call propaganda, constructed by the intellectual elites. The system for managing this has turned out to be the mass media. The title of the 1988 Massey Lectures is Necessary Illusions. Noam Chomsky.
Let me begin with a report in a church-based Latin American journal, datelined São Paulo, Brazil. The headline reads, Brazilian Bishops Support Plan to Democratize Media. The report describes a proposal which is now being debated in the Brazilian Constituent Assembly that would open up Brazil's powerful and highly concentrated media to citizen participation. Brazil's Catholic bishops are among the principal advocates of this legislative proposal to democratize the country's communications media. The report points out that Brazilian TV is in the hands of 5 big networks, while 8 huge multinational corporations and some state enterprises account for most communications advertising. The current proposal calls for a National Communications Council that would be made up of civilian and government representatives and would develop a democratic communications policy. The questions raised by the Brazilian bishops are being seriously discussed in many parts of the world. There are projects underway in several Latin American countries and elsewhere as well. There has been discussion of what's been called a New World Information Order. The idea is to diversify media access, to encourage alternatives to the global media system, which is under the overwhelming dominance of the Western industrial powers. An inquiry into such possibilities by UNESCO elicited an extremely hostile reaction in the United States and contributed to the near demise of the organization. The alleged concern was freedom of the press. One question I'd like to raise in these lectures is just how serious this concern is and what, in fact, it comes to, what's its substantive content. Further questions that lie in the background have to do with what a democratic communications policy would be and whether it's a good idea, and if so, whether it's an attainable concept. And more generally, just what kind of democratic order is it to which we aspire? The concept of democratizing the media has no real meaning within the terms of political discourse in the United States. In fact, the phrase has a paradoxical or even vaguely subversive ring to it. Citizen participation would be considered an infringement on freedom of the press. It would be considered a blow struck against the independence of the media that would distort the mission that they have undertaken to inform the public without fear or favor. Now, that reaction merits some thought. Underlying it are beliefs as to how the media do function and also as to how they should function within our democratic systems. There are also certain implicit conceptions of the nature of democracy. Let's have a look at these topics in turn. The standard image of media performance was expressed by Judge Gerfein in a decision in which he rejected efforts by the U.S. government to bar publication of the Pentagon Papers. In that decision, he said that we have a cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press, and it must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. Columnist Anthony Lewis of the New York Times commented on this decision and pointed out that the media were not always as independent, vigilant, and defiant of authority as they are today. But, he says, in the Vietnam and Watergate eras, the media learned to exercise the power to root about in our national life, exposing what they deem right for exposure without regard to external pressures. That, too, is a commonly held belief. There has been much debate about the media during this period, but it does not deal with the problem of democratizing the media and freeing them from the constraints of state and private power. Rather, the issue that is debated is whether the media have not exceeded proper bounds in escaping such constraints. The question is whether they have perhaps even threatened the existence of democratic institutions in their contentious and irresponsible defiance of authority. There was an important study on these topics by the Trilateral Commission in 1975. It was a study on what they called governability of democracies, and the commission, which is made up of elite elements from Japan, the United States, and Europe, the commission concluded that the media have become a notable new source of national power. This, they said, is one aspect of an excess of democracy that contributes to the reduction of governmental authority at home and a consequent decline in the influence of democracy abroad. This general crisis of democracy, the Commission held, results from the efforts of previously marginalized sectors of the population to organize and to press their demands. By doing so, they create an overload that prevents the democratic process from functioning properly. The American commentator Samuel Huntington, a professor at Harvard University, pointed out that in earlier times, President Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. In this period, then, there was no crisis of democracy, but in the 1960s, the crisis developed and reached serious proportions. The Trilateral Commission study, therefore, urges more moderation in democracy to mitigate what they call the excess of democracy and thus overcome the crisis. Putting it in plain terms, the general public must be reduced to their traditional apathy and obedience and driven from the arena of political debate and action if democracy is to survive. This study reflects the perceptions and values of liberal elites from the United States, Europe, and Japan. It includes the leading figures of the Carter administration, President Carter himself, in fact. On the right, the perception is that democracy is threatened by the organizing efforts of those groups that are called the special interests. That's an interesting concept of contemporary political rhetoric. It refers to workers, farmers, women, youth, the elderly, the handicapped, ethnic minorities, in fact, to the general population. In the U.S. presidential campaigns of the 1980s, the Democrats were accused of being the instrument of these special interests and therefore undermining the national interest. What is the national interest? Well, the tacit assumption is that the national interest is represented by the one notable sector that was omitted from the list of special interests: corporations, financial institutions, and other business elites. They represent the national interest. The charge that the Democrats represent the special interests has little merit. Rather, they represent other elements of the national interest, and they participated with few qualms in the so-called right turn of the post-Vietnam era among elite groups. This right turn had a number of different aspects. It included the dismantling of the limited state programs that were designed to protect the poor and deprived, the transfer of resources to the wealthy, the conversion of the state, even more than before, into a welfare state for the privileged, and the expansion of state power and the protected state sector of the economy through the military system. The military system domestically in the United States is in fact a device for compelling the public to subsidize high-technology industry and to provide a state-guaranteed market for high-technology waste production. A related element of the right turn was a more activist foreign policy. The goal was to extend U.S. power through subversion, international terrorism, and aggression, what's called the Reagan Doctrine, which the media characterize as the vigorous defense of democracy worldwide. In general, the Democratic opposition offered qualified support to these programs of the Reagan administration, and the fact of the matter is that they were largely an extrapolation of initiatives of the Carter years, and with very few exceptions, were strongly opposed by the general population. And that's a fact that's very clearly shown by polling results during this period. One should not be misled by Reagan's landslide electoral victories. In fact, Reagan won the votes of under a third of the electorate, and of the voters, a clear majority hoped that his legislative programs would not be enacted. Meanwhile, half the population continue to hold that the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, as polls regularly show. The Reagan phenomena, in fact, may offer a kind of foretaste of where capitalist democracies are moving in general, with a number of crucial features: the elimination of labor unions, of independent media, of political associations, and more generally the elimination of forms of popular organization that interfere with domination of the state by concentrated private power. Well, let's return to the media, which are charged with having fanned the ominous flames of excessive democracy. The Trilateral Commission concludes, I'm now quoting them, that broader interests of society and government require that if journalists do not impose standards of professionalism upon themselves, then the alternative could well be regulation by the government to the end of restoring a balance between government and media. Others have had similar concerns. The executive director of Freedom House, Leonard Sussman, asks the question, must free institutions be overthrown because of the very freedom they sustain? He too is referring to the allegedly adversarial behavior of the media. John Roach, who's the intellectual in residence during the Johnson administration, he answers Sussman's question by calling for congressional investigation of the workings of these private governments, who he claims distorted the record so grossly in their anti-Johnson mission. However, he fears that Congress is too terrified of the media to undertake this urgent task. Both Sussman and Roach are commenting on a 2-volume study of media coverage of the Tet Offensive of 1968, sponsored by Freedom House, written by Peter Braystrup, journalist. This study has been widely hailed as a landmark contribution. John Roach described it as one of the major pieces of investigative reporting and first-rate scholarship of the past quarter century. He calls it a meticulous case study of media incompetence, if not malevolence. This classic of modern scholarship is alleged to have demonstrated that in their incompetent and biased coverage reflecting the adversary culture of the 60s, the media lost the war in Vietnam. They therefore harmed the cause of democracy and freedom, for which the United States fought in vain. This Freedom House study concludes that these failures reflect the more volatile journalistic style that has become so popular since the late 1960s, and they go on to say that it is accompanied with an often mindless readiness to seek out conflict, to believe the worst of the government or of authority in general, and on that basis to divide up the actors on any issue into the good and the bad, where the bad actors include the U.S. forces in Vietnam, the military-industrial complex, the CIA, and the U.S. government generally, and the good in the eyes of the media are presumably the communists, who were consistently overpraised and protected, so the Freedom House study claims. There is, in fact, a striking and interesting aspect of the reporting of the Tet Offensive. Up until the Tet Offensive, the media had typically reported the war as the American command wanted them to see it. Journalists were taken on guided tours. There were very few that did anything different from that, and they presented the war as perceived under the control of the American military. But during the Tet Offensive, that didn't work. The war was all around them. They could look out the windows of their hotels and see fighting, and they saw that it was a very different war than the one that they had been programmed to present. In that respect, coverage of the Tet Offensive was different, but only in that respect. It's by now an established truth that it's almost inescapable that such broad coverage will undermine support for the war effort, particularly the often gory pictorial reportage by television. I'm now quoting from Landrum Balling, who's speaking in a conference that he directed on the media. The conference was devoted to the question of whether there is indeed no way to effect some kind of balance between the advantages a totalitarian government enjoys because of its ability to control or black out unfavorable news and warfare, and the disadvantages for the free society of allowing open coverage of all the wartime events. The Watergate affair in which investigative reporting helped force a president from office, as Anthony Lewis points out, that reinforced these dire images of impending destruction of democracy by the freewheeling, independent, and adversarial media. The Iran-Contra scandal contributed to these images. Two kinds of questions arise in connection with these vigorous debates about the media and democracy. The first are questions of fact, the second are questions of value. The basic question of fact is whether the media have indeed adopted an adversarial stance, perhaps with excessive zeal, whether in particular they undermine the defense of freedom in wartime and threaten free institutions by flagellating ourselves and those in power. If that turns out to be true as a matter of fact, we may then ask a further question: would it be proper to impose some external constraints to ensure that the media keep to the bounds of responsibility? Now, the question of fact, which is of course fundamental, is rarely argued. The case is assumed to have been proven. There are some, however, who have argued that the factual premises are simply false. Let's begin with the broadest claims. Let's have a look at the functioning of the so-called free market of ideas. There's an interesting study by Benjamin Ginsberg of the mobilization of popular opinion to promote state power, and after reviewing many features of this, he concludes that, I'm now quoting Ginsberg, he concludes that the marketplace of ideas built during the 19th and 20th centuries effectively disseminates the beliefs and ideas of the upper classes while subverting the ideological and cultural independence of the lower classes. Through the construction of this marketplace, Western governments forged firm and enduring links between socioeconomic position and ideological power. They've therefore permitted upper classes to use each to buttress the other. In the United States in particular, the ability of the upper and middle classes to dominate the marketplace of ideas has generally allowed these strata to shape the entire society's perception of political reality and the range of realistic political and social possibilities. While Westerners usually equate the marketplace with freedom of opinion, the hidden hand of the market can be almost as potent an instrument of control as the iron fist of the state. Now, these conclusions have some initial plausibility on guided free market assumptions that are not particularly controversial. Segments of the media that can reach a substantial audience are major corporations, closely integrated with even larger conglomerates. Like other businesses, they sell a product to buyers. The market to which they sell is advertisers, and the product is audiences, with a bias towards more wealthy audiences, which improve advertising rates. So in effect, the media are major corporations selling privileged audiences to other businesses. It would hardly come as a surprise if the picture of the world they present were to reflect the perspectives and the interests of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Furthermore, those who occupy managerial positions in the media or gain status within them as commentators belong to the same privileged elites, and it would be reasonable to expect that they would share the perceptions, aspirations, and attitudes of their associates. These reflect their own class interests as well. Journalists entering the system are unlikely to make their way unless they conform to these ideological pressures. Generally, they conform by internalizing the values. It's not easy to say one thing and believe another, and those who fail to conform will tend to be weeded out by familiar mechanisms. There are many other factors that induce the media to conform to the requirements of the state-corporate nexus. To confront power is costly and difficult. High standards of evidence and argument are imposed, and critical analysis will naturally not be welcomed by those who are in a position to react vigorously and to determine the array of rewards and punishments. Conformity to a patriotic agenda, in contrast, imposes no such costs. Charges against official enemies barely require substantiation. They're also protected from correction. Correction can always be dismissed as apologetics for the criminals. Someone who attributes the best intentions to the United States, while perhaps deploring failure and ineptitude, requires no evidence for this stance. So, for example, no evidence is required when we ask why success has continued to elude us in the Third World, Why cannot a nation of such vast wealth, power, and good intentions accomplish its purposes more promptly and more effectively? I'm again quoting Landrum Balling. One needs no evidence to condemn the Soviet Union for aggression in Afghanistan and for support of repression in Poland. It's quite a different matter when one turns to U.S. aggression in Indochina, or its efforts to prevent the political settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict over many years. All of this is readily documented, but it's unwelcome and therefore a non-fact. No argument is demanded for a condemnation of Iran or Libya for state-supported terrorism. Discussion of the prominent, arguably the dominant role of the United States and its clients in organizing and conducting this plague of the modern era, that elicits only horror and contempt, and evidence, however compelling, is dismissed as irrelevant. As a matter of course, the media and the intellectual journals either praise the United States for dedicating itself to the struggle for democracy in Nicaragua, or they criticize it for the means it has employed to pursue this laudable objective. A challenge to the underlying patriotic assumption is virtually unthinkable within the mainstream, and if such a challenge were permitted expression, it would be dismissed as a variety of ideological fanaticism and absurdity, even if it were backed by overwhelming evidence. Not a very difficult task in this case. Case by case, we find that conformity is the easy way. It's a path to privilege and prestige. Dissidence carries personal costs. These costs may be severe, even in a society that lacks such means of control as death squads, psychiatric prisons, or extermination camps. The very structure of the media is designed to induce conformity to established doctrine. In a 3-minute stretch between commercials, or in 700 words, it's impossible to present unfamiliar thoughts or surprising conclusions with the argument and the evidence that's needed to give them some credibility.
On Ideas, you're listening to the 1988 Massey Lectures by Noam Chomsky. Chapter 2, A Propaganda Model of the Media.
It's a natural expectation that the major media will reflect the perspectives and the interests of established power. These expectations, in fact, are amply fulfilled. That has been argued by a number of analysts. My co-author Edward Herman and I have published extensive documentation in joint work and separately to support a conception of how the media function that differs quite sharply from the standard version, what we call a propaganda model of the media. According to this propaganda model, the media serve the interests of state and corporate power, which are closely interlinked. The media frame their reporting and analysis in a manner that supports established privilege and that limits debate and discussion accordingly. To subject the model to a fair test, we've selected examples that are as closely paired as history allows. Crimes attributable to official enemies versus those for which we and our clients bear responsibility. Good deeds, for example elections, conducted by official enemies versus those in U.S. client states. There are by now literally thousands of pages of documentation supporting the conclusions of the propaganda model. By the standards of the social sciences, it's very well confirmed. If there is a serious challenge to this conclusion, I'm unaware of it. The highly regarded Freedom House study that I mentioned before, which is held to have demonstrated the adversarial character of the media, that study collapses upon analysis. It contains innumerable errors and misrepresentations, even falsification of its own documentation, and when all of this is corrected, little remains beyond a complaint that the media were too pessimistic in their pursuit of a righteous cause. I know of no other studies that fare any better. So to summarize, we have two models of the media. There's a sort of standard model, which is that the media are adversarial, cantankerous, obstreperous, that they confront state and private power, and then there's a debate over whether they do this too excessively. That's the standard model. According to the propaganda model, very much the opposite is true. The media are docile, submissive, and they serve the interests of state and corporate power. Those are the two models. And as I've suggested, the propaganda model has very extensive documentation to back it. I'll be giving some examples as I proceed. Now, there are, to be sure, other factors that influence the performance of social institutions as complex as the media. and one can find exceptions to the predictions of the propaganda model. Nevertheless, the propaganda model, I believe, has been shown to provide a very good first approximation which captures essential properties of the media and, in fact, essential properties of the dominant intellectual culture more generally. Journalists often meet a high standard of professionalism in their work. They exhibit courage, integrity, and enterprise, and this includes many of those who report for media that adhere closely to the predictions of the propaganda model. There's no contradiction here. What is at issue is not the honesty of the opinions expressed or the integrity of those who seek the facts. Rather, what is at issue is the choice of topics, the range of opinion permitted expression, the unquestioned premises, and the general framework that's imposed for the presentation of a certain view of the world. Now, I will give a number of examples to illustrate the workings of the propaganda model, but in these lectures I want to rely on the ample material that's in print to establish the basic case. This work has elicited much outrage, vituperation, and falsification, but to my knowledge there is no serious effort to respond to the critique. Rather, such critiques are simply dismissed. Notice again that this is in conformity to the predictions of the propaganda model. Typically, debate over media performance within the mainstream includes critics of the adversarial stance of the media and responses by people who defend the media. But such debate excludes any critique of the media for adhering to the predictions of the propaganda model. It even excludes any recognition that this might be a conceivable position. The media do cheerfully publish condemnations of their, quote, breathtaking lack of balance, or even the appearance of fair-mindedness, and the ills and dangers of today's wayward press. Charges of this nature are often not unwelcome by the media. The first reason is that response is simple or even superfluous, and the second reason is that debate over this issue helps entrench the belief that the media are either independent and objective, with high standards of professional integrity and openness to all reasonable views, or alternatively, that they're biased towards stylishly leftish flouting of authority. Either conclusion is quite acceptable to established power and privilege. Even the media elites themselves are not averse to the charge that they may have gone too far in pursuing their cantankerous and obstreperous ways in defiance of orthodoxy and power. The spectrum of discussion reflects exactly what a propaganda model would predict: condemnation of liberal bias and defense against this charge, but no recognition of the possibility that liberal bias might simply be an expression of one variant of the narrow state corporate ideology, as quite demonstrably it is. Let me return to the proposals of the Brazilian bishops concerning democratization of the media. One reason why they will appear superfluous or wrong-headed, if raised in our political context, is that the media are assumed to be dedicated to service to the public good, possibly even to extreme in their independence of authority. The assumption then is that the media are performing their proper social role, a role that was explained by Supreme Court Justice Powell. Powell stated, "No individual can obtain for himself the information needed for the intelligent discharge of his political responsibilities. By enabling the public to assert meaningful control over the political process, the press performs a crucial function in effecting the societal purpose of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees freedom of press." There's an alternative conception, which I believe is valid, and that is that the media are indeed serving a societal purpose, but quite a different one. They are serving the purpose that is also served by state education, as conceived by James Mill in the early days of the establishment of this system. That is, to, quote, train the minds of the people to a virtuous attachment to their government, and more generally to the arrangements of the social, economic, and political order. Far from contributing to a crisis of democracy of a sort that's feared by the liberal establishment, the media are vigilant guardians protecting privilege from the threat of public understanding and participation.
The 1988 CBC Massey Lectures continue on ideas, presented by Noam Chomsky. Chapter 3, Democracy and the Engineering of Consent.
Our political culture has a different conception of democracy from that of the Brazilian bishops. For the Brazilian bishops, democracy means that citizens should have the opportunity to inform themselves, to take part in inquiry and discussion and policy formation, and to advance their programs through political action. For us, democracy is much more narrowly conceived. The citizen is a consumer, an observer, not a participant. The public has the right to ratify policies that originate elsewhere, but if these limits are exceeded, we have not democracy, but a crisis of democracy that must somehow be resolved. This concept is based on doctrines that were laid down by the founding fathers of American democracy. Historian Joyce Appleby observes that, I'm quoting her, that the Federalists hoped that the new American political institutions would continue to function within the old assumptions about a politically active elite and a deferential, compliant electorate. The Federalist conception prevailed, despite their electoral defeat. It was expressed lucidly by John Jay, the President of the Continental Congress and the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Jay said, "The people who own the country ought to govern it." By the people, constitutional historian Richard Morris observes, he meant a small nationalist elite whom he was too cautious to name. That elite consisted of the white propertied males for whom the constitutional order was established. The vast exodus of loyalists and blacks to Canada and elsewhere reflected in part their insight into these realities. Jay and his associates were convinced that, as they put it, the people are well prepared for the government to assume that power without which government is but a name, and such few as are of a different opinion may easily be convinced of their mistake by that powerful argument, the halter. So one associate of Jay's wrote in 1783. John Jay's maxim that those who own the country ought to govern it, that is in fact the principle on which the Republic was founded and maintained. And in its very nature, capitalist democracy cannot stray very far from this pattern. At home, that means that politics should reduce, in effect, to interactions among groups of investors who compete for control of the state. This conception is what political scientist Thomas Ferguson calls the investment theory of politics, and he argues, I think very plausibly, that it explains a large part of U.S. political history. For our dependencies, the same basic principle entails that democracy is achieved when the society is under the control of local oligarchies, business-based elements linked to U.S. investors, the military under our control, and professionals who can be trusted to follow orders and serve the interests of U.S. power and privilege. If there's any popular challenge to the rule of these elements, then we are entitled to resort to violence to restore democracy. I use here the term that's conventionally employed by the media in reference to the Reagan Doctrine in Nicaragua, where we are restoring democracy. In reference to the Third World, the media contrast the Democrats with the Communists. The Democrats are those who serve the interests of U.S. power. The Communists are those afflicted with a disease that's called ultranationalism in top-secret U.S. government planning documents, such as those of the National Security Council going back for many decades. These documents explain very forthrightly that the threat to U.S. interests is nationalistic regimes that respond to domestic pressures for improvement of living standards and for social reform, regimes that have insufficient regard for the needs of U.S. investors. The media then are following the rules of the game when they contrast the fledgling democracies of Central America, which are under military and business control, with communist Nicaragua. And one can easily appreciate why the media suppress the 1987 polls in El Salvador that reveal that a mere 10% of the population believe that there is a process of democracy and freedom in the country at present. The point is that the benighted Salvadorans doubtless fail to comprehend the American concept of democracy. In accordance with these conceptions, there is no infringement on democracy if a few corporations control the information system. In fact, that is the essence of democracy. In the annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, a prestigious U.S. journal, The leading figure of the public relations industry, Edward Bernays, explained back in the 1940s that the very essence of the democratic process is the freedom to persuade and suggest, what he calls the engineering of consent. He goes on to say, a leader frequently cannot wait for the people to arrive at even general understanding. Democratic leaders must play their part in engineering consent to socially constructive goals and values. They must apply scientific principles and tried practices to the task of getting people to support ideas and programs. He doesn't say this, but it's understood that business will judge what is socially constructive, and business will engineer consent through the media and implement policy through the state authorities. If the freedom to persuade happens to be concentrated in a few hands, as it obviously is, we must recognize that that's the nature of a free society. Similar ideas are standard across the political spectrum. The Dean of U.S. Journalists, Walter Lippmann, observed that what he called the manufacture of consent has become, quote, a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government. He felt that this was quite appropriate because, in his words, the common interests very largely elude public opinion entirely and can be managed only by a specialized class whose personal interests reach beyond the locality. Lippmann was writing shortly after World War I. At that time, the liberal intellectual community was much impressed with their success in serving as, quote, the faithful and helpful interpreters of what seems to be one of the greatest enterprises ever undertaken by an American president. The enterprise was Woodrow Wilson's interpretation of his electoral mandate for peace without victory as the occasion for pursuing victory without peace. In this, he was assisted by the liberal intellectuals who later praised themselves in their words for having imposed their will upon a reluctant or indifferent majority. 15 years later, in 1933, political scientist Harold Lasswell explained in an article in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences that we should not succumb to what he called democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. The best judges are the elites, who must therefore be ensured the means to impose their will for the common good. When social arrangements deny them the required force to compel obedience, it's necessary to turn to what Lasswell called a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda, because of the ignorance and superstition of the masses. In the same years, the much-respected moralist Reinhold Niebuhr argued that rationality belongs to the cool observers, while the proletarian follows not reason but faith, based upon a crucial element of necessary illusion. Without such illusion, Niebuhr held, the ordinary person will descend to inertia. Niebuhr was then in his Marxist phase, and he urged that those whom he addressed, that is, the cool observers, recognize the stupidity of the average man and provide the emotionally potent oversimplifications that are required to keep the proletarian on course to create a new society. These basic conceptions underwent very little change as Niebuhr became what Richard Rovere called the official establishment theologian, offering counsel to those who face the responsibilities of power. After World War II, as the ignorant public reverted to their slothful pacifism at a time when elites understood that we must mobilize for renewed global conflict, historian Thomas Bailey wrote that, quote, because the masses are notoriously short-sighted and generally cannot see danger until it is at their throats, our statesmen are forced to deceive them into an awareness of their own long-run interests. Deception of the people may become increasingly necessary unless we are willing to give our leaders in Washington a freer hand. Moving to another point on the political spectrum, the conservative contempt for democracy is succinctly articulated by Sir Louis Namur, who writes that, quote, there is no free will in the thinking and action of the masses, any more than in the revolution of the planets, in the migration of birds, and in the plunging of hordes of lemmings into the sea. Only disaster could ensue, therefore, if the masses are permitted to enter the arena of decision-making in a meaningful way. Across the political spectrum, The fact that the voice of the people is heard in democratic societies is considered a problem to be overcome. The problem must be overcome by ensuring somehow that the public voice speaks the right words. The general conception is that leaders control us, not that we control them. If the population is out of control and propaganda doesn't work, then the state is forced underground to clandestine operations and secret wars. The scale of covert operations is often quite a good measure of popular dissidence. That was dramatically the case during the Reagan period. Among this group of self-styled conservatives, the commitment to untrammeled executive power and the contempt for democracy reached unusual heights. Accordingly, so did the resort to propaganda campaigns, targeting the media and the general population. One example was the establishment of the State Department Office of Latin American Public Diplomacy, which conducted such projects as Operation Truth. That was described by one high government official as a huge psychological operation of the kind the military conducts to influence a population in denied or enemy territory. The terms express lucidly the attitude towards the errant public, enemy territory that must be conquered and subdued. Sometimes the domestic enemy is hard to subdue. That was happening by the late 1960s. Lyndon Johnson was never able to declare a national mobilization to fight the Vietnam War efficiently in the manner of World War II, which turned out to be highly beneficial to the U.S. economy under the national mobilization. Johnson, in contrast, was forced to fight what was called a guns and butter war with deficit financing, and he was forced to do that in order to prevent an explosion in enemy territory at home. That was very harmful to the American economy. And after the Tet Offensive, business elites generally concluded that the enterprise should be liquidated as too costly. It was public dissidence and protest that made it too costly. That's a fact that should be remembered by people who hope to influence government policy in elite-run democracies. When the Reaganites came into office, they pretty clearly intended to undertake direct military intervention in Central America in the Kennedy-Johnson style. They assumed that the domestic enemy had been tamed. That was the import of the February 1981 White Paper. To their very great surprise, however, large-scale protest arose all through the country. The administration at that point turned to illegal clandestine operations. They were driven underground by the domestic enemy. This, in fact, is the real meaning of the Iran-Contra affair. In the dependencies, we may turn to violence to restore democracy. At home, more subtle means are required. The manufacture of consent, deceiving the stupid masses with necessary illusions, covert operations, while the media and Congress pretend not to see until it all becomes too obvious to be suppressed. At that point, we shift to the phase of damage control to ensure that public attention is diverted to overzealous patriots or personality defects of leaders who have strayed from our noble commitments. The task of the free press in such circumstances is to take the proceedings seriously and to describe them as a tribute to the soundness of our self-correcting institutions. In tomorrow's lecture, I want to concentrate on the project of containing the enemy, where in fact there are two enemies that have to be contained. One is the foreign enemy. The second are the residents of enemy territory at home, the domestic population.
The 1988 CBC Massey Lectures about media, propaganda, and democracy are presented by Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor in the Departments of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You can find an extended discussion of Professor Chomsky's propaganda model of the media in a new book he's written with co-author Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. It's published by Pantheon, and it's available now in libraries and bookstores. The Massey Lectures, produced for Ideas by Max Allen, continue tomorrow.